Welcome everyone to the introductory webinar to the new Altar Valley Watershed Plan. This has been a 3-year effort that has had a lot of participation by a diversity of partners, and we hope it can be of value to even more people. At today's webinar, you will learn about the purpose of the plan and how to access it. As I said, the webinar will be recorded and we'll post it on the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance website after this webinar, so anybody can access it in the future if you would like to. So it's great to see so many partners here who worked on the plan and participated in the many meetings and field trips we had for this process. There's also a lot of new people from outside the watershed who have not been involved. So we wanted to provide a little bit of background on what the watershed plan is and what the Altar Valley is. So first, for those unfamiliar with the Altar Valley, it's a 580,000 acre area in South Arizona that is southwest of Tucson. And the southern border is the US-Mexico border. The northern border is Highway 86. The western border is the Coyote and Babo Kivari Mountains. And the eastern border is the Sierrita and Cerro Colorado Mountains. So the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance itself was formed in 1995 by landowners and agriculturalists who wanted to work together with partners like land managers and science on big picture land management issues. And they've been working together for a number of years now to promote healthy and productive working landscapes for the next generation. So we're just going to share some slides to orient everybody to the planning process. All right, so the purpose of the plan itself was to provide a comprehensive overview of the current and desired conditions in the Altar Valley, to provide a concise reference and a unified source of guidance to agencies and organizations working in the Altar Valley with a focus on shared goals, promote solutions to complex problems and effective sustainable management practices in the Altar Valley, offer a toolbox of information and resources on stewardship practices, permitting, monitoring, and other topics. And then also, which is the biggest thing, identify, prioritize, and design general concepts for restoration projects important to accomplish across the valley over the next 25 years. We also wanted to outline a framework for continued monitoring, adaptive management, and collaboration in the valley. So the purpose of the plan is not to just be a standalone document that can just be read and then sits on a shelf. This was a very interactive and iterative planning process that was informed by all of the body of knowledge that had been developed over 25 years of collaboration and decades of work by landowners and agriculturists in the valley who knew a lot about the land. So we really want this plan to be able to be adapted over time and continue to be a living document. So who worked on the plan? Oh, let's do this. Sorry about this. So who worked on the plan? A whole collaborative of partners in the Altar Valley Watershed has worked on this. The biggest body of people who developed the plan was the Altar Valley Watershed Working Group, which in this diagram is depicted in this green oval. So this is a group of landowners, land managers, researchers, students, and basically anybody interested in the Altar Valley who has knowledge and wants to work on cross-jurisdictional issues. And within the Watershed Working Group, we developed 4 technical teams who had knowledge of the 4 main topics that people were interested in the valley. So wildlife, hydrology, community resources, and vegetation. And those teams throughout the process provided a lot of knowledge on what was going on and advice on what priority projects could be. In the middle here is the core team of partners who really guided the whole planning process. And they have been integral in making decisions about the watershed plan and making sure it's of value to different partners going forward. This purple diamond is the AVCA which I just described as a nonprofit organization. And we really help to drive the watershed plan. But the real decision making and implementation of the whole plan is to be done in partnership with the AVCA and the entire watershed working group. There are also two really important other groups that the AVCA works with and convenes. One being the Science Advisory Board, which is a group of scientists and researchers who do research in and around the Altar Valley, who provided advice on projects for the AVCA and Watershed Working Group for years and really help with the scientific aspects of the project. Then we have a fire coordination team that has been coordinating about fire management in the Altar Valley across jurisdictions to kind of look proactively at managing fires. And they have also provided input into the plan. So I wanted to introduce some of the members of our core team, which are some of the most important partners who have done a lot of work on this plan and hopefully will benefit a lot from this plan. First, I wanted to, introduce myself. I'm Julia Sittig, the Science and Conservation Director for the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, and I help to coordinate and write this plan. And then I'll kick it to Sarah King, who's the Executive Director, and then introduce some of the other core team members. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks everybody for attending this afternoon. We're really glad that you're here. I'm Sarah King, and I'm the Executive Director of the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, and I'm also a rancher within the Altar Valley.
Thanks, Sarah. Why don't we go to Karen Sims from Pima County, a member of the core team.
Sorry, I had to get myself, I'm so low, I can't. Hi. So I'm Karen Sims. I'm the Division Manager for Natural Resources at Pima County Natural Resources, Parks and Recreation. And we have, as most of you know, quite a few properties in the planning area and projects that have been proposed on some of those properties. So we've been very engaged, participating in lots of the working group meetings, the core team. And so, yeah.
Great.
It's been our engagement.
Excellent. And another really important piece of this puzzle was geomorphology and hydrology technical work by J.E. Fuller. And Cy Miller was the leader of that team. Cy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, Cy Miller, J.E. Fuller. Very happy to work on the plan. Thanks. Good to see everybody.
Thanks. And Cy provided a lot of technical assistance with the project design. Another member who's been working on this plan is Vanessa Prielson, member of the core team. Would you like to introduce yourself, Vanessa?
Hey everybody, I'm Vanessa Prielson, the Range Program Manager for Pima County in the Natural Resources Division. So I work with Karen and my other staff. Liz is also on the call.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa and Liz. All right. And we just wanted to mention that other core members of the core team included Rita, who is the Friends of the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge. Would you like to introduce yourself, Rita? Rita, you're on mute.
I'm trying to, there, unmuted. Hi, I'm Rita Rutledge with Friends of Buenos Aires. I'm on their board and I wasn't that involved, but I've been very pleased to be part of the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. And then we also got a lot of support from Southwest Decision Resources, who helped to design the planning process and facilitate some of the key workshops. Colleen Whitaker, I believe, is on the phone. Would you like to introduce yourself, Colleen?
Hi, everybody. Colleen with Southwest Decision Resources, and my colleague Tawny Robertson was also involved on this. We loved working on it with you guys.
Thanks for your support, Colleen. Great. So other key members of the core team included the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, and we have been working with them closely on some planning efforts as well, and we'll introduce that more in the next steps. So just as a review, we've done a lot of work together. The vegetation technical team had a couple field trips to discuss management strategies. The hydrology technical team had field trips to identify priority projects and start the design for those areas. The board and science advisory board had a field trip to inform the management strategies and priority projects. We've had youth crews out to maintain some of the priority projects and help decide where the next treatments should go, as well as working with landowners, contractors, researchers, and managers to design the next phase of the priority projects. So although this planning process occurred through the COVID-19 pandemic, we really made an effort to meet in the field when possible. We had a lot of virtual meetings, and we're very thankful to everybody at the Watershed Working Group who kind of helped to get through that, even though we weren't meeting in person. Okay, so here's the crux of this whole webinar and what you all want to know. What's in the plan and how should we access it? So we have a Watershed Working Group page on the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance website, and that will guide you to the whole plan. All you have to do is go to the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance website, or we have it as a link in the presentation that we'll share after this webinar. So on the website, we have a tab called Our Work, and we have the Altar Valley Watershed Plan in a tab. And this tab describes the plan, and it also has links to some of the relevant content. So here's a project summary, which we just went over. We wanted to mention too, that there are a lot of projects in the plan that are already underway. And I think that a special part of this process is that even though we were planning ahead for the future, some projects were already being done, and we kept adapting and updating the plan as those projects were underway. So here's some of the projects that have been created as part of this plan. It's not just this document, but here it is, and we'll go into that in just a minute. We created an interactive toolbox of literature, maps, graphics, and studies that pertain to relevant issues in the watershed. There are descriptions of the watershed issues and current conditions, so maps, data, and descriptions of the big picture issues that really span across projects in the watershed. Just some information and geographic maps on what the status of those are and how they're relevant to the Altar Valley specifically. We also developed goals, desired conditions, and management strategies. So expanding on the general guiding principles that the Watershed Working Group had developed years ago, we got more specific and defined what we wanted the valley to look like in the future regarding the different priority resources there are for management, as well as what management strategies should be done that will help move toward those desired conditions. Then probably the most important part of the plan is high priority collaborative projects. And partners got together in December of 2020 to start identifying what the most important projects were to collaborate on across the watershed. This plan doesn't include every single project that's going to happen in the Altar Valley. Individual landowners and managers are working on their own plans for that. But we really needed to highlight what kinds of projects that partners needed to work together on and pool resources on in order to accomplish them. Thinking about what issues are the most complex in the Altar Valley, how we can really proactively manage for the future. So let's jump into the watershed plan document. You can click on this link and it'll get you to a PDF. I downloaded the PDF and this is what it looks like. So we have a table of contents, of course, and in this plan document, you can just click on any of these headings and it'll take you directly to that portion of the plan. So in this plan document, there are the current issues and conditions as I just discussed. And this is a big part of the plan because many issues had been already defined for the Altar Valley, and two of those included management of the Altar Wash, which runs through the valley, and how to stop the lowering of the groundwater table and the down cutting of arroyos, and then also erosion control, grassland restoration, and brush management were two issues that were really highlighted over the past decade or two in the valley. But we also defined a lot of other ones that are up and coming. So including open space and urban development, infrastructure, dark sky resources, earth and water management structures, which have been very deeply studied the past couple of years, vegetation, fire management, wildlife corridors, and climate and drought. So as an example, you can just click on one of these sections and it tells you what the current conditions are with the different resources partners have worked on. In this instance, for wildlife corridors, a lot of the information on this was created during the Pima County Sonoran Desert Conservation Planning process. So we have a map of the corridors, biological cores, and other resources throughout the valley. So each little subsection within the current issues kind of looks like this: a description, some stats on the current conditions, and then a map of geospatially represented types within the resources, if that's appropriate. So that's the current conditions. Next in the plan, we have the collaborative watershed planning process. So this details how this plan was made. And some of you may not be too interested in all the sausage making of the plan, but in short, we gathered together a lot of different stakeholders at different points to engage on what was of most interest to them and got an inventory of their project ideas, also working through the desired conditions and management strategies with technical teams. We eventually defined criteria for prioritizing the suggested projects and collaboratively evaluated those projects to see which ones really floated to the top as far as the priorities. So here's what came out as far as goals, desired conditions, management strategies, and then the resource priorities. They're defined here. And then we have general collaborative management goals, kind of what all the partners in the Altar Valley are really aiming to do. So this is very specific to the Altar Valley. In other watersheds, you expect to have goals related to restoration, water resources, wildlife management, cultural resource management. But in the valley, we kind of have conditions for each one of those goals. So for example, connect tributaries to floodplains. Many watersheds in the Southwest have this goal, but in the Altar Valley, we really want to focus in uplands and or connections to the main Altar wash. So that's just one example of how we're trying to put conditions and specifics on each of these types of goals for the Altar Valley. And this is designed to guide management processes and plans into the future for anybody who is writing plans. We also have desired conditions. So the Watershed Working Group had defined main desired conditions of what they wanted the Altar Valley to look like about 5 years ago. And we really drilled down into these even deeper to create more specific desired conditions. All of these are summarized in a chart that contains what resources the partners really want to manage for, such as water infiltration, desired conditions, so water infiltration and soil and biological material deposition increase, and water runoff and soil erosion decrease. And how do we do that? So in the Altar Valley, what are the best strategies that we know of as of 2022 for moving toward that desired condition in order to manage the resource priority? So we have a chart for each of the 4 main priority topics: hydrology, vegetation, wildlife, and community resources for each of these topics. This again is really meant to be able to be copied and pasted into plans, into statements about why these resources are important and how to manage these in the Altar Valley. It's definitely not meant for everybody to just read through. And some of the components are repeated throughout different resource priorities. So design treatments to match sediment loads and erosion with channel capacity. This one is kind of a principle throughout hydrology activities in the Altar Valley, but it still is very relevant if you're looking to manage, say, erosion and sedimentation. So, like I said, a lot of these are repeated, but it's very important to have them for each of these resources that we're trying to manage. So that's just one other resource that we wanted to highlight if you're ever looking for language for planning processes or grant applications or anything that relates to the goals of what we want the Altar Valley to look like. We also have this element, the Altar Valley Watershed Toolbox, which I described earlier as a virtual interface. It's almost like a library of different resources that partners have at hand specific to the Altar Valley. So at the beginning of the watershed planning process, we'd have defined the priority issues for the watershed, and that's just what I scrolled through with the current conditions. So those same topics that are in the current conditions sections with some descriptions of what they're like now and why they're issues in the Altar Valley are depicted in this Altar Valley Watershed Toolbox. And this is really a place where we can just continue to deposit resources that different partners are working on as a central point of information for the Altar Valley. So topics in here include brush treatments, environmental and cultural resource permitting and avoidance, invasive species detection and mitigation, rural road design, construction and maintenance, seeding on rangelands, soil health and enhancement, vegetation, communities and conditions, weather, climate and drought monitoring, low technology watershed restoration structures, wildlife species conservation, and wildlife movement and corridors. We're also going to add a section on grazing management and actually just managed grazing, because we are the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance and we need resources on that. But we'll also continue to add resources throughout the years in different topics as this plan goes through different iterations. So for this watershed toolbox, anyone who's on the webinar, if you have suggestions for more resources to add to this, we can just put them in there. I'm the one who administers it and we can add them as links. But all you have to do in this library is to click on one of the sections in this top kind of table of contents that has these bulleted sections. So if you're interested in brush treatments, for example, here's a little overview of what we have for brush treatment resources. A summary of the issue on brush treatments and brush encroachment in the valley. We have a map of historic brush treatments. And you can actually click on this map and it'll take you to an interactive map. There's also a brush management matrix that was created describing the different types of brush treatments and where they're applicable in the Altar Valley. And then an example of a test treatment for aerial herbicide. So for each of these topics that are in this little horizontal table of contents, there are resources like that. There might be case studies on a specific treatment like we have here. There might be a map of the historic conditions like we have in this here, and there might just be a description of what the issue is. So over time, like I said, we're going to flesh this out and just continue building on it. This is one of the most adaptive elements of the watershed plan. The next section we wanted to go over is kind of the most exciting section, which is priority projects. So as I was saying before, we kind of got an inventory of the ideas that people had for collaborative projects in the Altar Valley early on. We had a set of criteria that we collaboratively evaluated the projects with. So each project that appears in this plan does have support from all landowners included in the project area. So not just on individual lands, but really have backing from the partners collaboratively. They have an ease of obtaining all necessary permits, ideally. Some of them, the permits aren't as easy to get, and the ones that aren't as easy to get were ranked lower. Potential for human and economic resources to be available for the project is a big one for feasibility of the project. Extent to which the project maintenance is planned. So knowing that each project does need to be maintained, if there isn't a plan in place to maintain it or an idea of how to maintain it, that would dock the points for that project. And then there's also the value and relevance. So the partners really wanted to have the project align with the desired conditions of the Altar Valley Watershed Framework, which was the foundational document created by the Watershed Working Group. We wanted a high potential for site enhancement, a high extent to which the project builds off current or previous work. So not starting from scratch or reinventing the wheel, but already having something to start from that informs a good project. And then just the general bang for the buck, knowing that the project is going to have a lot of value compared to the time and materials cost of the project. So that's how Watershed Partners evaluated each project. And then here's a chart of all the projects that were suggested and their rankings in the score from the Watershed Working Group. We did not cut out any project ideas in this plan that met all the criteria for feasibility. So if they were supported by all the partners, they're included in the plan. Some of these projects also are already being implemented, which is really exciting. So actually, these two top projects that were the most highly ranked are already happening. So wells are being improved for wildlife on the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge already. And then the Altar Valley Fire Operations Plan is in place and actually just informed management very heavily on the Contreras fire, which just happened a few weeks ago. So some of these projects are already being implemented, and we actually developed a way to track each of the projects and the value of each project over time. So as a watershed working group, we can be aware of the value of the project implementation. In the watershed plan, we also matched the collaborative management goal with the associated projects. So for those who were involved in the watershed planning process, we wanted to make sure that everybody who knows about the management goals and is concerned with how to move toward those desired conditions, how each of the projects is going to help us move toward those. So connecting all of those levels of where do we want to get with the desired conditions, how do we get there with the management strategies, and then what project supports each of those strategies. So this is a resource for us moving forward to see what kind of progress we're making. And then another important aspect of this plan was implementation and adaptive management. And this is kind of the last thing that the Watershed Working Group worked on as this plan was wrapping up. And this implementation strategy section details how we're going to track the progress of the watershed plan and then look at the conditions throughout the watershed over time so that we can proactively manage and also update how we manage in this watershed. This watershed plan has no ability to enforce any of the goals, desired conditions, or management strategies. It is really an aspirational document for everyone. And we want everybody to be able to come together in a voluntary way to work toward better future conditions. So we developed these indicators of watershed health just to see what was happening in the watershed. Some of the indicators are very influenceable by what projects are happening, and some of them are just environmental or have to do with other factors that we don't influence at all. But partners of the Watershed Working Group thought it was important to track what's going on so that we can inform our management better. So some of the indicators that we're going to be tracking about project impacts are, one, what are the direct impacts of the projects that are implemented? So if we do a brush removal project, how many acres were restored? If we maintain a road, how many miles of roads were maintained? Some of that really straightforward stuff, but at least we'll have numbers for over time. Collaborative funding secured. So thinking about all the time and money going into these projects, we want everybody to be able to get credit for what they put into these projects. And we can see over time how much has been invested in this watershed. That can also be used as match, potentially in grant applications for partners. We're also tracking which priority projects are shovel ready. So if they have the permits done and they have a concept plan done, they can be ready to go. And that's something to communicate to all the partners who are ready to do projects. We're also just tracking the participation in the Watershed Working Group. So not only number of partners who are participating, but the diversity of partners who is participating and is everybody empowered in their representation. Then there are the indicators of overall landscape health. And some of these are not affected at all by the projects, but some of them are. So we're still tracking open space and development. So how much of the Altar Valley is open space and how much of it is developed over time? It's really important to track how much land is made into subdivisions or infrastructure, etc. Wildlife, the status of special status species, if any of are removed from the list, added to the list, etc. And you can go down the line of the different conditions in the Altar Valley that were discussed as being influential to management. We had our first community meeting in the Altar Valley this spring where we discussed the results of the analysis of all of these indicators. And we're going to further refine them to be directly impactful to landowners. So we're going to probably heavily refine these in the next version of the plan based on landowner input. And that's exactly what's supposed to happen. So we really want to make this relevant to all the managers in the Valley and are constantly working on what data is involved in this indicator structure. So that's basically the end of the watershed plan. There's just a little bit of a wrap up at the end of the document with some next steps, but those are the main elements that are relevant for the plan. We wanted to highlight for all of you as well that in addition to the plan document, in the watershed toolbox, there are a ton of GIS resources available in this plan. The Quiet Creek has been our GIS contractor and manager for, I think, 5 or 7, maybe 10 years now before I joined the Alliance. And Robert Davis, who is the leader of the Quiet Creek, was not able to be here today, but they were an absolutely indispensable part of this process. We wanted to highlight this dashboard that they created of the different priority projects in the watershed plan. So more than just a list of projects, we want everybody to be able to visualize where the projects are in the overall project area. So the Quiet Creek made this great dashboard of the types of projects, including the community ones in purple, hydrology related in blue, vegetation in green, and wildlife in orange. And you can actually click on a project or one of these shapes on the map and see what the description is, what topic it's related to, and then you can see the project description in the Altar Valley Watershed Plan. So also highlighting that each one does have a description written for it. So for example, here's Western Altar Wash, water infiltration and head cut reduction. You can click on this link and it takes you to, oh, it takes you right back to the dashboard. That's not good. Hopefully it should take you to all the links for the project. The project descriptions are also included in the Altar Valley Watershed Plan itself. And they're also listed on the website as a separate page. Sorry, I'm not navigating this very well. So if you go to the watershed plan page on the website, there's actually a subpage that directs you to a list of all the priority projects. And that list links you to a concept plan for each project. So here's the high priority collaborative project list that I just scrolled through in the actual plan. And in here, here's a list of all of them with a little description of what each one is with the different types of projects. And then these links, so here's the Western Altar Wash one, a link to a project description. So each of the projects that are prioritized actually have a written document like this. So they're ready to go into more detailed planning and then have funding resources gathered for them. So for each project, there's a description with potential project partners, purpose, relationship to the desired conditions, value, implications of no action, work and/or studies to date, a project map, activities, any description of what would happen in this project, and then a cost estimate, as well as the permits that would have to be obtained to do the project. So for each of those 29 projects that I just scrolled through, there's a planning document like this. And those documents will continue to be updated over time, especially as they're implemented. We actually have a worksheet for tracking the implementation of projects so that we can standardize that as well. Okay, so back to the plan. I think that was all we wanted to go over about the plan itself. Hopefully you have a good idea of how to access the plan document and then the different sections that are on the website and then the geospatial resources and tools. Does anybody have any questions about the sections or content of the watershed plan or how to access them?
Julia, this is Karen. If somebody forgets like where the Google site or the link is there an easy way to search for it or find it? Like, what would you recommend for that?
I would recommend just going to the AVCA website. But
Okay.
another aspect of it is that this plan can really be posted on anybody's website. So if it's easy, that PDF document can be uploaded to anybody's website or put in your like internal files. So if there's an easier way for you to access it, you can just download it.
Hi, Julia.
Yes, hello.
This is great work you all have done. Would you be able to place the links in the chat box, you know, the main Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, and just if there's any things that you've presented today that we could have a link to, that would be great. So that way everybody has it right here and now.
Yes, thank you. I should have done that while I was presenting and wasn't able to multitask. Oh, so Sarah just posted altarvalleyconservation.org. That's the main website. And then the watershed plan is right below that. And that's the plan webpage with that summary. And then under the products produced is the watershed plan. If you guys have any advice on how to more easily access the plan, like I personally don't know how to make it more visible on Google searches, we might be able to work on that as well. So yeah, any suggestions are very welcome.
Julia, it looks like Rita has a question.
Oh, yes, Rita.
On the wildlife corridor, I wonder if you can explain what that includes.
Is that a project?
I thought there was something in there on wildlife corridors.
Yeah, there's a lot on wildlife corridors. So one project that we wanted to work on is a brush treatment corridor for wildlife enhancement. And that is grassland restoration to open up a habitat corridor from the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge all west to the Baboquiviri Mountains and north. And as you know, the refuge is already working on brush treatments, as well as a bunch of ranches in the Altar Valley. We've done a lot of brush treatments, and it would be really great to connect them all in one big, great habitat corridor. And there isn't too much work to be done to really do some maintenance on the existing treatments and then connect them. So that's probably our biggest corridor related project that's in the plan.
Okay, I have one other insight. I don't know if you've heard about a collaborative group including Sonoran Desert Alliance and Saguaro Park West, Game and Fish. They're working in the Abra Valley, yes, but they're trying to come down, cross over into Altar Valley. And part of what they're doing is removing fences from areas of ranchers, private companies. We're working with the water company right now. So if there were people out there who had outdated fences that they would like removed, but it just hasn't risen high on their schedule, that would be a possible collaboration there.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I've actually been attending some of their recent meetings because, so for all of you who aren't familiar with the Abra Valley, it's one watershed north of the Altar Valley, directly north, but the same river runs through it. So it's really just a matter of geography, like north of Highway 86 is Abra Valley, and they've done a ton of wildlife connectivity work and studies, and it's really exciting to see what's going on there. And Rita, we actually have a project in the plan that is removing barriers to wildlife movement. And that project isn't very well fleshed out, knowing that there are a lot of fences that could be made wildlife friendly in the valley. And then some of the pinch points and barriers really opened up. So it would be really great to work with the Abra Valley on kind of like getting momentum for that in the Altar Valley on a larger scale. There are individual landowners and actually the refuge too that have been working on some wildlife friendly fencing, but those are only in specific little points. So yeah, that's a great idea. It'd be awesome to work with them. And then just as a note, this is now July 2022. The plan was finalized in March 2022. So we're already almost half a year beyond the finishing of the first version of the plan. So we're almost in the next round of soliciting new projects, updating that priority project list. So if you're in the Altar Valley or outside the Altar Valley and have project ideas, we're definitely always accepting them and they always come up. So as a rolling process, if you have any ideas, just feel free to shoot them to me or Sarah or anybody that you know in the Altar Valley. So I think Rita was getting to this a little bit, but we did want to ask all of you just in the chat box about any related efforts that could be informed or supported by this plan. So as you're seeing this webinar, getting familiar with what's in this plan, do you know of any efforts that are new that we haven't listed that maybe should be informed by this plan or could learn from what we've done? And we should reach out to them to kind of just connect the efforts and align them. If you do, please put them in the chat box.
Julia, this is Karen.
Yeah.
If it's appropriate, I was just going to mention what Pima County is going to be getting to move forward on. Do you have that on the agenda later? Or?
Yeah, so this is for the next steps. And one future planning process that we really want to concretely move into is Pima County's Altar Valley Resource Management Plan. So Karen, go ahead and introduce.
Okay. So just for everyone on the call, I know many of you are familiar with us talking about what we were calling the LAVA or Lower Altar Valley Plan. We've now just made the decision to basically have the same geography as the Altar Valley Watershed Plan, but it's very specifically focused on Pima County's properties. This is a requirement we have as a result of the multi-species conservation plan that when we allocate Pima County properties as mitigation for development projects in the county, we're required within 2 years to develop a plan that basically helps us to make sure that the resources that mitigation is occurring for are protected, if that makes sense. And then we also look at other things, like we'll look at recreation use, at our grazing management. We do have grazing plans on several of the properties already. We'll look at fire management, those kind of topics as well. So we're going to have on August 8th, just kind of a 1 hour like this, a 1 hour introduction to our the planning process that we're going to be going through. And we're going to, as much as possible, use products and everything from the Altar Valley Watershed Plan. It was our original intention to kind of try to do this simultaneously, but we got diverted because we had to do some riparian mitigation and write a plan for the Cienega corridor first. So now we're coming back to this area. So if you are not, if you've not been like a regular participant in the Altar Valley technical teams and would like to hear more and maybe participate in that August 8th meeting, and then we'll be having a more detailed one to get input from everybody on some of the resource priorities for that plan. If you want to, you know, private message me on the chat or just send me an email or whatever works for you. My email is really simple. It's just Karen_Sims, SIMMS @pima.gov.
Great. Any questions for Karen? So the other planning processes that we are going to roll this into include a restoration for Brawley Wash. And Evan Canfield has been the main connection between the Altar Valley and Brawley Wash planning processes. He's not on this call, but I know he really wanted to be, and he's been very, very involved in this process. So they're actually in a pretty similar way looking at that whole watershed. That's really the Avra Valley, that same wash. It's called the Altar Wash in Altar Valley and the Brawley Wash in the Avra Valley, but it's the same wash. A restoration plan to really look at helping the water resources there specifically be more valuable and conserved in that area. So we've been participating in that, and hopefully components of the watershed plan will just be carried forward. And then there are a lot of activities on the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge that include an environmental assessment for work to be done in the Altar Valley and supported by the refuge, which is pretty revolutionary for them to be assessing areas outside of the refuge and seeing how they could support the whole Altar Valley. And so a lot of the best practices, resources, desired conditions in the watershed plan have already been put into that draft EA. That environmental assessment is not out yet, but it will be upcoming. Other next steps include, as I said before, refining the indicators of landscape health. So a lot of different watersheds throughout, the West and the US and the world have been delving into how to monitor the health of landscapes and kind of evaluate what it's looking like. And having some data that can track the conditions over time and directly inform managers and landowners in the Altar Valley is going to be extremely valuable. So if anybody has advice on creating indicators of landscape health, we're more than happy to work with you. We developed our indicators in cooperation with the Cienega Watershed Partnership, who has been working on indicators for many years. And then Southwest Decision Resources has developed indicators for a number of different watersheds and areas. So it's really cool to just be another watershed that has data and can kind of share that throughout the region. And as I said, we'll be updating priority projects in the watershed plan on an annual basis. So here we go. If you have more projects, please let us know. And of course, continuing to implement the projects. So I just wanted to introduce a little bit the projects that are already happening because we're pretty excited about it. Some projects that are ongoing already are the Altar Valley Fire Operations Plan, which basically is a contact list and a map of water or firefighting resources in the Altar Valley. So contacts for the land managers, grazing permittees, et cetera, that fire managers can just contact as soon as they're on an incident. And then also looking at what resources to protect, values at risk, and then areas that might be beneficial for burning. And as I was saying earlier, fire managers are already using this fire operations plan, and that was created by that fire management group that I described earlier in this presentation. Well improvements for wildlife on the refuge. So wells are being updated to function as wildlife waters, and surface waters for wildlife are pretty rare in the Altar Valley and are only existing as man-made structures. So cattle tanks, ponds that are artificial are the only perennial surface waters available for wildlife. So putting that into kind of a system and making sure that there is a good amount of distance between each water source is a priority for Altar Valley partners, and the wells on the refuge are just a part of that puzzle. We've mapped the wildlife waters in the valley, and we also did a recent assessment of Chiricahua leopard frog habitat in the valley that'll feed into future projects to kind of create that network. Another project that's ongoing or happening already is actually fence improvements in the Babo Kivri Mountains. And this is a good example of a project that actually wasn't ranked that high because it is fence improvements on the ridge line of the Babo Kivri Mountains, which are hard to get to, it's expensive, and nobody actually thought it was going to happen. But now it may actually happen as a result of the Contreras fire that just occurred. The fences that were burned need to be improved. And so that's just one example of not wanting to cut out a project just because it doesn't seem great at one time, because resources might come down the pike for people to utilize. So it's great that we kind of had the idea and concept for that before the fire came in. And we were just describing the Altar Valley Brush Treatment Corridor to Rita. A lot of brush treatments have been done in the valley, and connecting those and maintaining them is a high priority, as well as analyzing the results of the different treatments. So we've been, I don't want to say experimenting, landowners don't do a lot of experiments because it really takes money, but really practically trying to find the best and most cost-effective way to manage brush and restore grasslands in the Altar Valley for a long time. And we've been doing research on the conditions of the grasslands after different types of brush treatments. And after our most recent treatments, which included grubbing and aerial herbicide, we have plots to study the vegetation regrowth. And the Arizona Game and Fish Department actually has taken over some of these plots and analyzing the results of those within their statewide study of which brush treatments seem to be most effective in different environments. So that was a cool connection to something that was ongoing and kind of being able to connect with a project that a partner was doing. Also, an ongoing project is the La Osa Wells Riparian Project, which is going to involve creating a perennial water source stocked with Chiricahua leopard frog on the La Osa Ranch, which is a very exciting project, just to provide really good wildlife habitat and provide one of the only perennial water sources in a large distance. Okay, does anybody on the call have any comments or questions on the existing projects?
Julia, this is Karen again. One of the projects on there, which is the Rancho Seco mines, abandoned mines project, Pima County has initiated work not on that specific geographic area, but broadly on remediating abandoned mines. So we do have a lot of inventory work that's been done on Rancho Seco on those mines, and we're beginning to develop a really good data management tool and priorities and some other information, so that that's hopefully a project we'll be able to get underway in the future. So at least some preliminary steps have been done on that.
That's really exciting. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting.
Awesome. We can update that project description and then have a little project tracking sheet that says we're getting a database together. Great.
It is Carrie, and for Karen, there's also several finished projects in that same area that was done earlier on Rancho Seco as part of the early survey work, but there was also some National Fish and Wildlife Foundation fencing projects that were done by Dawn and Iris.
Great. That's good to know, because I don't think I have all of the information that I should have. So
yeah, so
thank you.
Just building on that earlier work.
Yeah, and then we've also talked about looking at some of the waters on Kings 98. I'm going to forget what you guys decided it was called, Charlie's Tank or Lake or
Charlie's Lake.
Charlie's Lake, you know, that area and the Pumpback Pond, and looking to see, just like they're talking about on Rancho or La Osa, you know, looking at potentials for more permanent water in that area too. But that'll be something that gets incorporated in the plan that we'll be working on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carrie and Karen. And then Sharon said in the chat, based on my visits to the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, I'm guessing the primary need for management is increasing water to the refuge. How does that interface with the Altar Valley Conservation Plan? So that's a really good example of how the plan itself is kind of an umbrella that has goals and objectives to support specific areas. So increasing water to the refuge definitely is a high priority for wildlife management and making water more available to wildlife. We also want to start monitoring groundwater levels more. There haven't been a ton of, actually, I don't think there have been any comprehensive studies of the groundwater in the Altar Valley. There have been some done on a few wells and just smaller areas of groundwater to see how long it takes surface water to infiltrate into the aquifers. But the refuge is working on their kind of own projects. We certainly don't want to push them into doing any projects that say you need to get more water on the refuge. That's not the purpose of the Watershed Working Group. But as the refuge does have projects like those well improvements that we were just describing that have to do with this, the Watershed Working Group can help them find resources for it, inform how they're doing the project, and just kind of act as a body of knowledge to just support them and how they do it. Does that make sense? Is that clear, Sharon? If it isn't, you can chat more. Okay, any other questions or comments on projects that are ongoing? All right, so I'll just roll into a wrap up and just restating the next steps. The Watershed Working Group, which is the group that developed this document, is going to continue to meet. We're going to meet on priority issues and planning projects and activities, one of them being the Pima County's Altar Valley Resource Management Plan. That's kind of going to be the venue for a lot of the workshops to inform that plan at the stakeholder level. And any other planning processes that continue into the future will be worked on by that group. So it certainly was not something just for the watershed plan. We talk about updates from different land managers and researchers and enthusiasts of all types. So if you're interested in attending the Watershed Working Group meetings, we meet about quarterly. And then we have those technical teams. If you're interested in a priority topic, like you're really interested in wildlife, vegetation, hydrology, or community resources, you can certainly join those technical teams. You can also just be part of the mailing list to keep track of what's going on with that group. That's totally fine. Some members of the Watershed Working Group don't even participate in the meetings all the time, but they do actively keep up with emails and give us any information and updates on pertinent activities that occur in the Altar Valley. So if you're interested in becoming part of the Watershed Working Group, put your email in the chat, or you can email myself, Julia, at altarvalleyconservation.org. Okay, any other questions or comments on the watershed plan before we wrap this up? Thanks, Sarah. Yes.
Julia, this is Matt McGoffin with the Arabipa Watershed Conservation Alliance.
Hi.
I just want to thank you guys for putting this on. You've done a heck of a job. It's a good,
Thanks, Matt.
really good document.
Awesome. Lisa, you have a question or comment?
Actually, I was starting to put it in the chat, but then I thought I got a chance real quickly. I'm now in New Mexico. I've watched this evolve there in the Altar Valley for years, and I think it's just wonderful. I ditto what Matt said, but I am going to be starting from scratch in a new watershed, trying to kind of start putting the similar kind of thing together across a whole mix of jurisdictions and private land and so forth. Any suggestions on where to start or how to start?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know.
Suggestions and so many questions. I feel like these plans are such a work in progress and every area does it differently, but we should, if you want, we could just connect on a call really quick to just, if you want to ask any questions, or we can share our experience and some of the challenges and what we went through. We'd be really happy to share that from our perspective, and maybe even connect you with other people who have completed watershed plans, because yeah, a lot of groups have done them and have had different ways of succeeding.
Lisa, I'd start off with a wash tub of cold beer and wine.
Right. How about around the campfire, Carrie?
And Sarah says, stay unified on what you can do, not what you can't do. That's
Absolutely.
definitely something we've lived by.
Yeah, no matter what, right.
Yeah. And celebrating successes, I think, is a big part of it. And I hope that as a watershed working group, we can get together with some ice cold beer and some wine and celebrate everything that we've put together and the successes that have come from already implementing some stuff with the plan. So thank you everybody who took part in this 3 years of meeting and planning and thinking really hard. I think it's an awesome product and we're really excited to see how it can be of value to everybody living and working in the watershed. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll be in touch soon. Have a great rest of the day.